Hi guys.
So,
Hi, thank you for the invite. Agree
hello,
with what Kelvin said at
hello.
the end. Hello, hello. I didn't wanna get into the mo- get into the speech that Kelvin was making, but of course, largely agree with that. So if you want, we can also spend a few times on that, or we can jump into the next topic. Up to you. You have the agenda to set up.
No, it is all up to you now. So you can go ahead and
Um,
take the stage.
Let me. I asked Victor before whether I need slides. He said, "No, you don't need anything." It seems like he rugged me because without slides, it would be pretty hard. Um, Let me share my screen if that's possible. Is that fine?
Yes, of course.
Cool. I was just doing it while listening to just putting something together as like at least some visual to bounce off. Um, Please interrupt me at any point, and maybe it's more fun to make it like a conversation rather than a boring monologue, right? So whatever point you think is interesting to elaborate on and discuss, would be good. Yeah. So up to you on that. Overall, I guess coming from the topic of the conversation is decentralization and Gearbox being a DeFi protocol. There are many things what could discuss because there is decentralization of the protocol itself, of the code base, right? Then it is decentralization of the processes, of the finances, of the spending, and a bunch of other things like that are being discussed in DeFi for since its inception, right? How much control does a team have? How much control is it ideal to have, right? And it also gets to Kelvin's point and what he was talking about at the end of the previous panel, as to say, is that while it is true that many of the things are iterative, some people are against iterations in general, right? Like they say, okay, you deploy a protocol, it's supposed to be brick and stone. I wouldn't say Bitcoin is exactly brick and stone, right? It was changed, I think, twice. There was one fork and another one. But it's not like it's changing all the time, right? Its purpose isn't to do that. While if you look at the Ethereum ecosystem, it's much more to change. So I guess if we try to nail down the things and get to the question that we could actually discuss about at first before jumping into gearboxes, what is the actual distinction, right? I'm not a fan of doing definition fighting because when you try to argue in definitions, conversations get very boring and diluted, right? But in general, if you look at why DeFi or decentralization is beneficial to users, right? It's because if you have TradFi, then you just put assets, let's say, into a bank or into a broker or somewhere. You can ask them to do something for you, but end of the day, however they are complied, KYC regulated, anything can happen, right? We've seen it with the what was a German payment system that 2 years ago literally disappeared with 2 billion or something euros? I think you remember that case, right? It was a pretty large, like financial, not a bank, but something like that. So it was all regulated, right? They had all the papers, everything, but again, it just disappeared. So I feel like as a DeFi user myself, and I guess when we talk about a DeFi user, you can also say blockchain user, right? You can pretty much, in many cases, make it one to one because both are finance in many ways when you talk about it. The question is, what is it actually that you benefit from it? Is it when you run your own node, as people like to say, and you verify your own code? Or is it about just that you like that there is at least not one person being in control, right? There could be like a cluster of validators, a cluster of stakers. So, of course, there is a degree of centralization always, but at least you don't have one person controlling it all, right? Um, what is that for you actually? What would you say in this case? Like, is that why you are in blockchain? If you were to talk about decentralization specifically, or there is some other value you derive from that? If the question makes sense.
I think that is it. You mentioned just now, so that not only one people, not only one person holding.
Yeah, sure. So I guess that would be a reply for many, right? And that's the
Yes.
thing.
Mhm.
When people criticize DAOs and criticize decentralization, for example, they say, okay, let's just make a few examples, right? They say, okay, if you centralize exchanges and Lido will be controlling the majority of the stake of Ethereum, right? Which is somewhat but then you don't get into the facts that Lido is a protocol, for instance, and it has many different participants, being even self-hosted nodes, right? Some other providers, staking pools, and so on. So it's not just one party. While in comparison, in a bank or
Mhm.
somewhere else, it is truly one party. When you talk about, let's say, DeFi governance, take any large protocol, right? Why you're on Aave anywhere else? People say, okay, there are only like, let's say a couple dozen active big voters, right? And they pretty much decide the majority of it. That's still magnitudes better than what we already have today. So people say, no, your processes are not as decentralized. For example, your spending, it's only a few teams working on it. But 3 teams working on the protocol is already better than one centralized team, right? And at least they do it openly. So it becomes the question of like where on the spectrum you want to be. It's always like a degree, right? In security systems as well, you cannot make something fully false proof, right? Even if you have a protocol, you do things like monitoring bots, some limits, some time windows, some collateral limits on the TVL itself, right? You do a bunch of these things. And when you jam it all together, it is supposed to work, right? I don't know, like, I'm not an engineer myself, but if you take cars, right, just how do you call this thingy that kind of like protects your face if you crash into something? Was the airbag, right? I think. Like you have the airbag, right? You have the brake system, you have a bunch of things. So all in all together, they're supposed to make it better. But of course, 100% it's never going to be as amazing. Same with any system, really. So that's, I guess, like a bit of an intro into the topic. Does it make sense? Or maybe you would want me to dive into something a bit more specifically. So for me, when people talk about decentralization, be it in DeFi, blockchains, or anywhere else, it's just about what is the core value you derive from it, and what is the degree you want to be on the spectrum, for instance. Well, curious to hear what you think. Just not to turn it into a monologue as well, you know.
I think you can go on, Ivan.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Let me switch to maybe something a bit more Gearbox specific, right? Like some practical things we ended up doing. So in Gearbox specifically, right? If I got you right, if I ever at some point lose the trail of your question, please just interrupt me, okay? So, of course, a DAO cannot start from day zero. For a DAO to be there, like DAO, again, not to argue in definitions, is an autonomous organization, right? So if you are hardcore comparing everything to the rule of the letter, then the only DAO you could really say there is probably Liquidity, because it is fully autonomous, right? So even the DAO, it's more like a protocol, really. It's deployed and you can't change anything, right? Everything else is not autonomous. It is decentralized. It is organization. So people just call them DOs. Again, we are not here today to argue on that. We are here mostly to look into practical things. From day zero, it's hard to have a DAO really, because you need to have a period of time where people from the outside, and people can be anybody, can be venture capital, sole developers, developer teams, users, speculators, anybody, right? They need to gain enough knowledge of a system to then be able to even ask questions, to have especially any kind of voice or opinion, right? Because before you are able to form an opinion or do something, you at least need to have some degree of information, even if it's a small degree. So with Gearbox, before the DAO was launched, there was a few month period where different content, code, docs were being published so that every piece of information is as open as possible. And that's generally how in this DAOs and, like, let's say, this open projects and organizations, it works, because you need to explain things as much as possible so that people can later on just understand what is happening in every aspect of it. Okay, the DAO was launched, right? Do we want to get into the topic of distribution or no? I feel like it's not that relevant for this, or we do actually, because there is some cross-reference with Sybilin, right, and other things we can discuss, but I don't know. Absolutely, yeah. So I feel like one big thing when people talk about distribution is let's say they open any token, any financial system, right? And they say, okay, there are 5 organizations or people that have the majority rate. Not the majority, but a big chunk, which is always going to be like that. In general, in finance, because of inflation and other factors, things will always gravitate. For example, I don't know, Apple stock being the biggest in SPY ETF, right? It's always going to be like that it's going to gravitate towards a few being the biggest ones, but there still will be distribution within it. The same thing with like token distribution, even worse, actually, not worse, but even more prevalent, you see it there. Even if you start with 0% token supply on day zero, right? there will still be a few actors who have more time or more information or more external capital at the beginning. And if they don't sell or they don't move it or they accumulate through other means, they will be able to actually get more of a stake, right? That's the thing. It's anybody's choice to do it, but the outcome is that a few groups will have a larger supply. That can be supply of the token, that can be supply of the votes, and it can be supply of whatever. It's just that as long as you have something that is finite in the present time, you will have such gravitation towards a few groups. What is it called? The power law distribution, I feel like, right? Is if I'm correct, could be mixing up with something else. So with Gearbox in practical terms, right? We try to balance the distribution as much as possible. So there was a period when testers and speculators could engage with the protocol, test it, play with it, deposit whatnot. So that's one part of it. There was a period of people who just wanted to back because, of course, there needed to be money for audits and something. So usually in most systems, you have either a preemptive fundraise or fundraise via OTC post fact, right? Doesn't really matter. It ends up being people who contributed capital for it. It could be even distribution via mining. Still, there is a degree of money component, right? So it's just a different phrasing of it. Of course, developers who contributed code, initial members who were just active, evangelists, and so on. The goal was to balance the distribution as much as possible. But one thing we did is that we distinguished between the token supply from the financial perspective and the voting power at the beginning, right? Some protocols actually try to separate those two because there is distinction between a stakeholder and a shareholder, right? Stakeholder, somebody who, is it correct, right? I feel like the stakeholder, if I remember correctly, is the party that kind of cares about the longevity of the system a bit more, while shareholder kind of maxes it out, right? Both are actually important and it needs to be in check again. It's about balance. Anyway, you cannot imagine a developer who worked 2 years on the code base to have the same, like if you want to be like fully fair, right, in that way. You cannot imagine them having as much supply as somebody who just entered Telegram, put I don't know, $1,000 into the protocol and wrote the question. So even then, even if you don't create a disbalance from the beginning, your incentives need to map out to incentivize behavior that's more needed for the system. So a developer or a large capital contributor will always end up having a large voice. Just about how you, like, at the beginning, you just need to make it as fair as possible, right? At the end, it's going to be how it is, which always gravitates toward the biggest. So even though in Gearbox, developers got a larger share than just regular protocol users, because again, a different level of commitment, risk taking, and so on, the voting power of those who had more at the very beginning was actually much reduced by 5 times, or by 5 and 8 times, I think, at the beginning. So that way, at the beginning, when the system was still forming up, there was reduction in the voting power of those who had more. So that was kind of a way where it felt like the community felt it was more fair. To jump a bit on the side, fair is a point and perception that changes over. What is considered fair today wasn't considered fair, I don't know, 10 years ago, even 1 year ago in the industry, and it's going to be fully different tomorrow. For instance, when the market was bullish, which feels like ages ago, but it really was about only 20 months ago, right? Everybody said, if you don't do it, yeah, exactly. People said, if you don't do a fair launch, meaning there are no VCs, there is no capital, everybody just starts mining from the beginning, right? Then you're a scammy project and you're trying to grab a bag for yourself. That's what people said. As soon as market became bearish, people actually asked, oh, how much runway do you have, right? Or how long are you going to be here for a round? And when you ask that, you kind of assume there is capital behind it. So the concept of fair really changes with the market cycles all the time. Like at the bottom, at the top, everybody hates VCs because why would somebody get an edge in investing? But nobody remembers that if a VC invests at the top, they have to sit through the entire bear cycle, which many people who are most retail participants cannot do, cannot basically take it, right? And the other way around. So people hate VCs at the top, they love them at the bottom because they support their bags and vice versa. Developers at the top are seen as the holy grail and everybody listens to them. At the bottom, because developers cannot pump the price, nobody listens to them. So it's like, again, concept of fairness is always changing depending on the context. Please ask some questions so I get back into the more specific topic because I feel like I'm going a bit on the side too much. I feel like the point of distribution was touched, right? So there was distribution,
Yes.
cannot make it too flat, but you could make voting power in the initial stages more flat. And again, end of the day, whether it's 1 year, 2 years down the line, the system is supposed to mature, and then you probably need to just let it run by itself. Again, most parts of it, not all, of course.
So are you saying that the newcomer will never be able to get to have more than the developer or anybody else who's been there in the earlier stage? Like never, like no chance.
Good question. If we try to distinguish voting power versus capital, like financial aspect, right? Maybe we can say there is a way. If we only look at tokens as financial aspect of it, probably no. Unless let's say if you start a system, right, and it lives and it develops, it's supposed that the system's value grows, right? The network value grows. So that's what people work on it, right? Like without any security questions and anything like that. That's why people work on it, so that the value of the system grows by itself, either due to it being a bigger network or it's actually earning fees or whatever it is. So if you were in the system early on, then it is supposed that you get more in the beginning, right? For example, I don't know, you are an employee number 1 in Apple or Microsoft, or you're employee number 10,000, right? It's not going to be matching whatsoever because of the size back then. However, if things go through market cycles where they reset to the bottom, right, you have another chance of entry. And that is what markets make it. I don't know if again, it's not called fairness, right? It's just that if you have the opportunity, you can seize it. If the market retraces back to that or even lower. Yeah. Because developers who start something and they work on it, that's what happened last 2 years, right? Every project that started 2 years ago, Gearbox included, now is valued pretty much at the same level or even lower, right? And even though a lot of capital was contributed, a lot of dev power was being put into it, yet now people have an opportunity to enter at the lower level. Again, is an opportunity or it's just all going to zero? That's something I guess we're not really touching upon today, right? But that's again, in majority of cases, somebody who joins later, if the system is alive, and let's say it has been alive for a while, somebody who joins later, even if it's a developer, will not have as much as somebody who was early on. Otherwise, my question would be, why would you even be early on in the first place, right? Like, what's the point if you taking the risk, putting your time in, evangelizing for something and things like that, if you're going to be at the same level 3 years later? Again, while inflation exists, that concept of like you being early is better than being late will still be a thing.
So I have one question for you. Well, it's actually 2 questions in one, just for the general user here. The biggest question here for me, so, we've been talking about this. What is Gearbox? What kind of roles does it play? And why is decentralization important for Gearbox?
Understood. So let's start, I guess, with the last one because it mostly ties to what we're discussing. Gearbox is a financial protocol, which basically allows users to either earn passively or take leverage and use it in DeFi. So not like a centralized exchange, but a protocol that is decentralized and doesn't have any KYC restrictions or anything like that. It allows you to take like leverage natively, DeFi natively on chain, which is something that's pretty unique. How you use it, where you enter it, what you farm, trade, whatever, those financial decisions are all up to the users. There are no vaults that force you to it. So there is a degree of composability, a high degree of composability, and a high degree of agency that any user can do. And the benefit of that in blockchain is that a user always is either a physical personal user, right? It can be a company, it can be a bot, it can be a fund, it can be another protocol, right? So by making all these things from products into primitives, you allow for a system to be bigger than it is potentially, right? Because you can have things you haven't imagined before, like Ethereum, right? And EVM. Nobody imagined what it could be back in the days. Vitalik himself didn't predict the use cases that are here today. I mean, if you probably made a list of 100, then probably majority go in that list. But again, if you make a 100 use cases list, you'll probably be quite right in many cases, because it takes such a big cycle. In terms of why decentralization is important for finances, because I guess the PayPal could, I don't know, send the bank transfer from outside of SEPA. So, for example, even from Europe, okay, from Europe to US, it's still okay. But anything that's not Europe and US, try to send around cross-border, it becomes a mess. It's again, I don't want to get into the old pitch, but it's slow. You get a bunch of freeze and a bunch of questions. You can't even send your own money. I believe even in the US these days, it becomes quite a pain point, even for rich, wealthy people who have good banking relationships, and they just close them down. So that like was why Bitcoin was created, right? If you refer to the original paper, that was the reason. Because the system was false, and also because the system didn't allow for people to do what they wanted to do. For Gearbox, why decentralization is important is for a similar reason. Is because when you're a user and you try to, I don't know, send transactions, invest in something, deposit somewhere, you always take counterparty risks, right? And these days, counterparty risks, even if they're acceptable, for example, you rely on a large institution that probably is very unlikely to fail, you don't know what else is behind it, right? For example, you buy, I guess people get this question, you buy paper gold, right? You want to buy gold exposure. You're not going to buy bullion, so these physical ones, because it's unsafe to store them at home. You buy it on an exchange. But that means that contract or futures or whatever you're buying is underwritten by some other counterparty that is then brokered somewhere else, that is then custodied somewhere else. So the amount of counterparties in that fake composability realm you're essentially exposed to is absolutely astronomical, right? It's just so many levels that you got into it. So people who are interested in finance, who have witnessed 2008, right, where a bunch of stuff was just like put together, right, securities, obligations, bam, send it over, and then it was just a pyramid. In DeFi, you have the benefit that it's all open. That even if something is shit, you still can see it's shit, right? You can, if you read enough and you spend enough time, you can even check the code. So you can see how much something shitty is. Now, whether people actually look into it or not, the obvious question is the majority of the time they don't, right?
Yes,
and those who
that's
even
right.
can look into it, they forget about it. Yeah. But if the concept of it being open, right, is the similar thing is like, I don't know, let's say you don't like election systems in the real world, right? Because you say, oh, the biggest party will win anyway, right? But there is still a degree of insight and transparency you can look into it, right? I guess, I mean, there are different regions, right? There are different people who can volunteer to have these ballots or whatever. So in many democratic countries, it's still better than it used to be, right? When somebody just says, oh, this is your king. So it is better now. You can see what is behind it. You can see the contract of an asset. You can see the contract of a vault you're depositing. You can see where your profits come from. Because when you're in a bank, they tell you, okay, invest with us. Then you deposit, you pay a huge fee. And then they say, you now have exposure to IT sector of Western world. Then you have some agriculture exposure in Latin America and stuff like that. You can probably, if you annoy them and you back into the bank with a hammer, they will tell you where your assets actually are. But otherwise, no. And I'm talking about not like some shady banks. I'm talking about the top ones, right? There is some, you just basically throw it into a black box. So for users who have dealt with PayPal freezing them, with the bank not allowing them transactions, with the any KYC AML bullshit that really doesn't work, right, in the real world, they know why DeFi, or some call it open finance these days because they're disappointed, why it is beneficial, right? You can see into things. Now, that is the openness of it, right? But there is also a degree of control and oversight that somebody has. For example, in these open finance protocols that we all know, is it really DeFi if there is only one team working, right, and there are 5 main developers and there is a multi-sig? From one side, you can say if the multi-sig is public people and they're all known, then it's better. Well, then the question would be, how is it better than a company controlling a bank, right? Pretty much like if they're all friends. Then you can say, oh, but they maybe have more liability and they're publicly known and they're good people, they have ethos. Well, we see how often ethos goes wrong. So, like there are many of these questions that are like mental gymnastics, really, right? End of the day, it's still better than the old system, but then it's the question of like, how decentralized do we want to be? Because if you really want to be decentralized when it comes to DeFi, you need to have decentralized, you better have no control, right? Or you need to have some multi-sig or like admin functions in the protocol that are under a time lock, so it can be just executed and done at once, right? So you need to implement even more checks and balances. For example, not a multi-sig, but an actual on-chain DAO, not immediately executable to remove attack vectors by the DAO, right? Remove even emergency multi-sig if you can. What else do you need to implement? Remove any admin functions related to taking out user assets, like it happened not long ago with the Summerfy, right, where an attacker of
Yeah.
who was it Jump of Intermute. It was again there was no Multi per se. It was still a company, right? It wasn't a DAO, but still all of these things remain in there. But then we actually get to Kelvin's point where teams go through bear market, they iterate, they change things, right? They try to improve it, they constantly improve it. But here's the thing, being able to improve, being able to fix means you have a degree of control, right? Because if you don't have a degree of control, you're not fixing and improving anything, you are basically deploying new versions. But that means you never, as a team, as a developer company, you never really owned your user base. It was always outside of your control. So what is your even financial incentive to do that, right? There are a lot of these questions that are like, in ideal world, you want it to be all set in stone and never to change. But as time goes by, cycles change, people's perception changes. It always changes as well. Sorry for going long overboard there. Please stop me.
It's all
Oh,
right.
I got to thank you very much. Actually, it's about time for Fiona to move on to the quiz section. So, Fiona, I have to thank you once again for joining our conference, and it's been a pleasure talking with you, and hope we can find even more chances to collaborate with you and with Gearbox and
Gearbox, yeah.
somehow.
Thank you very much,
Which-
Thank you.
Kelvin.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good luck with everything.